Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT, and welcome to today's Chicago Tonight Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. WTTW is committed to producing and presenting trusted best-in-class content fueled by distinctly Chicago sensibility. We have served as Chicago's window to the world, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Today is a special voices conversation focused on racial inequities in housing, exploring the history of discriminatory practices in real estate and rental market, the public housing system, access to home ownership, and the impact of gentrification. Today's special Chicago Tonight Voices community conversation is provided in part by the Chicago Community Trust. The generous support of donors, sponsors, and WTTW members and viewers like you make it possible for WTTW to bring provocative ideas to life, to tackle the issues that matter, and to expand on perspectives on the world which we live. There's only one reason why this is possible, and that reason is you. Thank you for your support. Now, before Brandis Friedman join us, I would like to play a clip from WTTW's Firsthand Segregation digital series, in which we explored the high cost of segregation to the city, not just in dollars, but in lives lost and unrealized potential. Following the video, please welcome our host and Chicago Tonight and Black Voices anchor, Brandis Friedman.
So we first wanted to try to live on the west side. A lot of the houses were in really poor condition, but they were really expensive. So we were approved for $250,000, and a lot of the houses that we were looking at was about $250,000, but we would have to put in about at least $100,000 just to be able to make it livable. They wanted a lot, but we thought, well, you know, we're teachers. We're doing good in the community. We should be able to purchase a home in the area that we want to purchase a home. So we were kind of upset because we weren't able to find something that was conducive to what we needed on the west side. We went to a few homes, one home in particular that we weren't able to get into. The owner was under the impression that we were not Black. And he heard that we were Black, the tone changed. Because when we called him, we were actually in front of the house. He was stuttering and he was just like, well, the lock code is, and he gave us the code and didn't work. He wouldn't pick up the phone again. Our realtor did speak to him and eventually told us that it was due to race. That could have been the house that we dreamed of, but to know that just because we were Black, we couldn't even look in the house. He wouldn't even let us in. That's the main part of the segregation, being forced out of where we really wanted to be. And when we get to another area, not being able to get what we want because we're Black.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this WTTW News Community Conversation, and thank you for spending your afternoon with us. I'm Brandis Friedman. As Tim Russell said earlier, I'm, of course, the host of Chicago Tonight, as well as Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Chicago residents today, they still see the impact of the city's segregated past, and one of those lasting impacts that we still see today is in housing. The city routinely ranks among the most segregated big cities in America when measured by the Dissimilarity Index. That's a tool that's used to gauge how evenly distributed demographic groups are throughout a distinct geographic area. Local organizers, researchers, and everyday Chicagoans are working to uncover the costs of housing segregation and fight for fair housing in their communities. So again, thank you all for joining us. You're in a listen-only mode right now, but that does not mean that we don't want you to be part of the conversation. We do definitely want to hear from you. So please chime in with that chat function or the Q&A function with your questions and your comments. I will be sure to get them to the guests throughout. And I also want you all to know, I think Tim Russell just dropped it in the chat. You saw a clip of that firsthand segregation segment, but you can see more firsthand at WTTW.com/firsthand/segregation. And of course, I should mention, if you just go to WTTW.com/firsthand, you can see so many more of our extraordinary firsthand series and their storytelling over there. So let's start by introducing the guest that we have with us today. I want to bring in Charles Branham, a former professor of history and a senior historian at the DuSable Museum of African American History. Alejandra Cancino, a senior reporter at Injustice Watch. She reports on housing and the courts. Geoff Smith, the executive director and principal investigator for the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University. And Nikki Patin, program director at RAGE, that is, of course, the Resident Association of Greater Englewood. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having
Brandis.
Of course. So, Professor Branham, I want to start with you, please. Would you start by, start at the beginning? As African Americans first began moving to Chicago, we all know during the Great Migration, what were some of the housing challenges that they faced while they were trying to find a place to live?
Well, the most important housing challenge, of course, was the resistance of whites in the surrounding areas for African American presence on the near South Side. Racial segregation of African Americans preceded the Great Migration, but the Great Migration obviously would intensify between 1916 and 1920. The population of what came to be called Bronzeville literally doubled, and then it would double again through the early 1920s. So African Americans became a force to be reckoned with in terms of the demand for housing. Moreover, you had African Americans who were called old settlers, who'd been here for quite a while, who were moving to the edges of the African American community, and these are the people who were most challenged. Between 1917 and the race riot of 1919, you had more than 25 racial bombings of African Americans who simply sought more decent housing. And so what you saw is literally a block by block expansion of what was known as the Black Belt. And it was known as the Black Belt because it moved largely south, because it was hemmed in by whites on the east, and because it was coterminous with what was known as the Red Light District on the near south side of Chicago.
You'd think I'd remember to unmute after all this time. Thank you, Professor Branham. So give us a sense then about what that meant for the conditions that people were forced to live in once they were able to find housing.
Well, three things come immediately to mind. One is the terrible overcrowding. I mean, you're talking about literally thousands of African Americans arriving in a very short period of time. Many of them have friends or relatives who've come before them, who've told them about how great Chicago is, who've told them about economic opportunities in Chicago. I mean, you literally could move to Chicago and double your income because Chicago paid better. Plus, you had the opportunity for better education. Plus, you had the right to vote. Plus, you had generalized freedom from the persistent white violence that characterized African American life in the South. So blacks came, many at the urging of the great Chicago defender. And as they came, they found that they were literally wandering around in search. I mean, there was a time when you had literally thousands of African Americans in search of housing and maybe 25, 30 units available in what was known as the Black Belt. So the first thing I would think about is the overcrowding. I mean, you had apartments cut up into kitchenette apartments. You had periods of time in which you had the hot bed system being used. The hot bed system is one person gets up in the morning and goes to work, and somebody who's working at night comes and sleeps in that bed. You had people sleeping in coal bins at the bottom of apartment buildings because it was being rented out to you. And of course, you had rent parties where people would have parties on the weekend to raise some money so they could pay the rent. So overcrowding first, but then of course with overcrowding comes health crises. I mean, that many people, even young people, jammed together in poorly maintained units, desperate for housing, which is often under repaired and abandoned, means that, and of course, being charged more, having to pay the black tax to live in any kind of housing in the Black community means that you not only are paying more for less, but you are going to face the continuing risk not only of overcrowding, but of white violence, white resistance to your presence.
Thank you for illuminating, for shedding some light on all of that for us, Professor. Alejandra, I want to get you in because in Justice Watch, you all just last week released The Tenant Trap. Tell us a little bit about your reporting there.
Yeah, and so we wanted to know what was the conditions of buildings in the city of Chicago, and we have been hearing from tenants about having building conditions that were really difficult still today. Some of them referred to them as slum-like conditions, right, of a foregone era. And so we ended up doing some data analysis. The city of Chicago, every time that they send an inspector, the inspector files the violations that they see in what it's known as the data portal. And so, there's multiple different kinds of inspections, and we ended up using an all city metric that determines what is a serious violation. And we figure out that there are about more than 2,600 buildings in the city of Chicago that have a history of serious chronic building code violations in the city of Chicago. So the next question was, well, what can we tell, or can we figure out whether or not these are buildings where low-income people are living? And so we ended up using evictions because evictions is a measure of affordability. A lot of the people who cannot afford to pay the rent end up in eviction court. And so when we matched the data by addresses, we ended up figuring it out that the majority of these buildings where there's a history of serious code violations are also buildings where low-income people live. And then the next step, we were wondering, as we were going through, we were talking to tenants, and we were realizing that a lot of the tenants who live in these buildings use what they think is the only tool available to them, which is withholding rent to try to pressure the landlord to make repairs. And so we ended up realizing that some of the tenants that were withholding their rent were landing in eviction court. And then at the same time, the city of Chicago, which for the most serious cases end up taking the building owner to court to address the code violations. At the same time that the tenant was in eviction court, the landlord was in housing court because of the code violations. And we thought, well, that is really interesting. How come the tenant cannot defend themselves in eviction court by saying, well, I didn't pay my rent because my landlord didn't fix the apartment? And so that led us into this year-long program to try to answer some of those questions. What we ended up finding out at the end is that there's a system that is stuck against the tenant, especially in court. The tenant is more likely to be evicted a lot earlier than the landlord is forced to make fixes in the building or make repairs in that building.
It sounds like almost, sort of cyclical, right? It's the apartment is in terrible condition, so I'm not paying the rent, and then you did all the reporting, so Alejandra, tell us, because you mentioned a serious code violation. What is a serious code violation? What would constitute that?
Yes, and so we ended up using, so back in 2015, the city created a measure in which they actually spelled out this specific number of codes are considered serious code violations. So you see things that could lead to something that is could become a life or death issue, right? Like, so not having fire alarms in the building, or having things that are blocking the exits of the building. Rats, right? Having one of the buildings that we profile extensively had a serious issues with rat in the building. That is considered a health hazard. So those are some of the examples.
And Alejandra, you spoke to some of today's renters, many of whom are in Black communities. And when you talk about these living conditions, does it sound like, or does it appear that anything has changed? Because I mean, maybe we're not hearing of the overcrowding that Professor Branham mentioned, but it sounds like conditions are still really serious.
They are very serious still. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that there is at least 3 buildings in every single ward of the city, right? So this is a citywide problem, but is disproportionately concentrated in Black communities, right? These are communities that are already suffering from the burden of evictions, the burden of gun violence, and now we're seeing that there also are. This is also where these buildings are concentrated, and so it does raises the question, right? Like, what kind of a city do we want to live in, and how do we make sure that these buildings where mostly Black low-income tenants are living are buildings that are up to healthy standards, up to the city's code standards.
Geoff, some of your research, you all look at the state of the rental market in Chicago. What is the relationship between housing conditions and the city's affordable housing stock?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things to keep in mind when we think about rental housing affordability is where most low moderate income renters find affordable rental housing. I think there's some perception that it is often found in subsidized units or public housing, and I think the reality is that the vast majority of modest income renters are just out there on the market trying to find low cost rental buildings. And so that's why Alejandra's story is so important, because the types of properties that she's describing are the common type of properties that many modest income renters are trying to find, essentially, because that is how, unfortunately, the market provides affordable housing in many neighborhoods that have been subject to historic disinvestment, where property conditions have deteriorated, and there really isn't a private market, essentially, that is able to improve those properties while also keeping them affordable.
And Nikki, according to Alejandra's reporting, the greater Englewood area had about 30% of the buildings with these serious code violations. Do residents, how do they feel the impact? How would you describe that on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So actually, that's part of our work. We're part of the Chicago Neighborhood Recovery Program. And so part of what we do is that we actually travel throughout Englewood surveying vacant properties or deteriorating properties. We have a list in like a specific area that we're looking in and that we're working in. So residents report back to us often, not just about like vacant properties or like, not great conditions like in their buildings, but also things like vacant lots, things that, owners are maybe not cleaning up or not maintaining in the right way. So we document and we note that. I will say too that because our work is about mobilizing residents and resources to engage in that housing transformation, part of our work is community-led real estate development, where we're tackling exactly what you're talking about, Geoff. So we've identified the strategy, which is a very well-known strategy that a lot of folks use, and it's called super blocks. For super blocks, what we do is that we look at blocks that have 5 or more vacant properties, and then we bundle them. We're working with a construction partner, JLJ Construction. They're a Black-owned construction company, and also the operator of the just newly approved first only non-union carpentry apprenticeship in the city of Chicago, which will be based in Englewood. So we're working with JLJ to bundle the rehab on multiple properties at one time in order to bring down the cost of fixing up those properties and making them more affordable for people who live in Englewood, and particularly Black families in Englewood to be able to purchase. So we're sort of taking a both-and approach. We're trying to map and document the sort of poor conditions that Alejandra has highlighted in her report, but at the same time really trying to come up with some strategies and solutions to directly tackle that problem ourselves.
Is this the kind of work or practice that could be replicated in other communities?
Absolutely. That's actually part of what we do. We document sort of everything that we do. We write it all down. We take lots of photos, lots of videos, because we do think that this is a model that could be replicated in other communities and with other nonprofits. Part of the way that we're able to do this, and I'm going to give a very quick lesson in nonprofit administration really quickly, is that a lot of nonprofits, their funding is tied to programs, as they're called, meaning, how many people showed up, you have to do these many sessions over this amount of time. They're going to cost this much money. And that's cool because it keeps people accountable and it gives folks like structure. We operate in a different way, though. Our funding is largely unrestricted, which means that we're able to leverage funds to sort of address the needs of people directly. So another thing that we're looking at are things like having an emergency or a sort of responsive rehab fund for our residents in Englewood. So let's say, for example, we have a landlord who wants to be a good landlord, wants to provide safe and stable housing for his tenants, but maybe there's a roof repair that he needs done that he can't get done, or maybe something's affecting his plumbing system and the price tag is like 5 or 10,000 and they just might not have it. So we're trying to set up our funding in a way that we can actually mobilize those resources to people to tackle some of the smaller problems or some of the smaller structural issues that end up ballooning into these huge fines and these huge situations where now all of a sudden folks are getting evicted, the property is falling down and it's dilapidated, and then eventually it becomes vacant and then eventually demolished. We're trying to figure out where are the stopgaps where we can just stop those issues before they even balloon bigger.
Thank you for explaining that. And I want to remind our guests, our participants who are joining us, a couple of things. One, we've included the link to firsthand segregation in the chat, as well as the tenant trap, the reporting by Injustice Watch. You can go there. But while you're there, drop us a question or a comment if you've got one. I just want to, there's an opportunity to remind everybody that you're a part of the conversation as well, and the chat or the Q&A are places to do that. Professor Branham, we talked about this a little bit at the start about, how, what housing was like for Black folks in particular as they were coming to Chicago. But, the city is still one of the most segregated in the country. Remind us how that got started, please.
Well, there are several origins. And one of the great things I think about the program that we put together, the 4-part documentary, Shame of Chicago, Shame of the Nation, is that we tried to chart all of the ways in which racial segregation was created and intensified in Chicago, because Chicago in one sense becomes the model for so many other cities. They learned how to segregate from us. They learned how to keep African Americans confined by following Chicago. And so first you have, of course, the use of violence. And that culminates in the race riot of 1919. And the race riot of 1919 is one of those watershed events that reshapes not only the African American experience, but reshapes all of Chicago. And in the aftermath of that, and of course, the race riot of 1919 was not merely caused by housing conflict, although housing conflict was one of the most important factors. But after that, then you have a variety of tactics. One, of course, was rezoning the city of Chicago. Secondly, you have the papering over of the city by restrictive covenants. And we didn't invent restrictive covenants, but we kind of perfected restrictive covenants. Then, of course, we have the professionalization of real estate, and Chicago becomes the center for this professionalization. Its origins may have been relatively benign in that you have people who were self-defined progressives who simply wanted to rationalize and professionalize the selling of real estate, but very much at the heart of that was this assumption that African Americans are a detriment to the property values of whites, and that a professionalization of real estate means to use every tactic available to prevent any realtor from renting any property or selling any property to African Americans in non-African American communities, or at the very least to allow them only to move into communities that already have begun racial change, but to keep white space white. And so restrictive covenants became a very important tool. Then you have, on top of the use of restrictive covenants, you have the concentration of minority populations, especially the concentration of Black populations, through the use of public housing. And while public housing's origins are very important because government does have a role, or should have a role, in providing decent housing to those who are desperately in need of it, and certainly African Americans were the first to be victimized by the Great Depression and the last to be able to pull themselves out of the Great Depression. The housing, public housing in Chicago largely was a means of confining and containing the Black presence. African Americans were going to be funneled into public housing, which began, and many of those who were early residents of public housing thought it was definitely a step up, thought it was definitely an opportunity to enter the middle class. It was well maintained, but it quickly deteriorated. Maintenance quickly declined, and African Americans found themselves even more concentrated and contained within Black belts, both on the south and west sides of Chicago. It became a prison surrounded not merely by white communities that the political powers and the economic powers sought to preserve, but by a lily white suburban ring around the neck of Black residents.
All right, thank you. Are there? I feel like there are. We've talked about some of the things that the real estate organizations did, but obviously the federal government, some would say, and local governments as well, were also had a hand in the segregation that we see in Chicago. And there are modern day, versions of this. And I'm gonna throw it out there and see who wants to take this one, Professor Branham or Geoff Smith, if either of you is.
Well, I will add one thing, and that is to build on what you just said, and that is the role of federal policy, the FHA, and federal housing policy to reinforce racial segregation, because basically what the New Deal did in many instances was simply work in coordination with local powers. In the case of housing, that meant that they worked in coordination with banks and with realtors who already had these policies set in place. Now they just funneled more money, including Black taxpayers' money, to confine African Americans and to provide a mechanism that not only reinforced racial separation, but that literally contributed to the stripping of African Americans of the opportunity to pass down generational wealth. For most people, your home is your greatest financial asset. For African Americans, this confinement and this exclusion meant that African Americans were not able to profit from the increased value of their homes as whites were able to do.
Can I also add something to that, Dr. Branham? Because I think you're absolutely right, of course, right? Like definitely stripped of the opportunity. But one thing that we have not, and I don't think we've discovered this at RAGE, but I certainly think that we are actively responding to it, is that along with owning a home, it's not just a financial asset, it's also an educational asset. That if your parents know how to navigate the real estate market, if they know the ins and outs of real estate transactions, if they understand how to hold an inspector accountable or an appraiser accountable or their attorney accountable, they have a much better chance of not only gaining that asset, but then sustaining it and holding on to it. So part of our work too, especially with RAGE, is also educational, because a lot of folks have no entry into education around real estate if their families have not already participated in that. If they've not already navigated just a simple real estate transaction, everything about it is going to feel overwhelming. It's going to feel confusing, and people definitely don't make it easy to figure out like what's the right way, what's the right path, what are the things that you need to know. So we do that through a virtual homebuyers education course called Buy the Block that's designed specific to Englewood, because we recognize that part of what has not been passed down, in addition to finances, is knowledge, insight, education to even be able to take advantage of the opportunity to purchase real estate. So I wanted to add that in too.
Let me say that is an incredibly important point and an incredibly important contribution that you are making, because next to learning your ABCs, learning financial literacy is the most important tool for educating African Americans, not only to acquire property and shepherd themselves to financial success, but also to basically give them an opportunity to be able to pass that knowledge down generationally.
And I
Alejandra,
would say,
go
oh
ahead.
yeah, go ahead. No, I was just going to add that something that I thought was really interesting when we were interviewing tenants is that the history that Dr. Brennan spoke about continues to be a history that resonates today. I mean, I've spoken to tenants who share with me that they are descendants of sharecroppers who moved to Chicago looking for jobs, that their grandparents bought a house during the recession at a variable interest rate, and when that interest rate increased, they lost their home, and that they felt that displacement had become some part of the Black experience, which was made them obviously it was really heartbreaking for them to kind of think about that and think about the displacement that is happening today in many of our Black communities, right? Like especially around the Obama Presidential Center, which is set to open in 2 years. And so that history continues to be alive, and I think is something that we continue. It continues to resonate, and it continues to be part of a question. It's like, well, what do we do then? Like, what are the solutions of this problem that continues to impact mostly the Black population today?
And Alejandra, what are some of the challenges that tenants run into when they're trying to get help, like on the rental front?
Yeah, and on the rental front, it's become, and this is something that Geoff has done some research on this as well, right? It's like the number of apartments for low-income tenants, it's not increasing, and the demand for those apartments continues to increase. And so we have, this gap of, I think the number is 120,000 units, of affordable housing units that is needed. That means that there's a huge demand for these homes. I mean, I've spoken to tenants who have waited in there's programs at the federal level that subsidize the rent, and they have waited 10 years for a subsidized apartment. And then they get to that subsidized apartment, and that apartment has significant amount of issues. And so they thought they were entering a stability, and the issues in that apartment continues to be part of the issues that does not allow them to find a stability, right? So now they're spending their money trying to buy rat traps, trying to buy cockroach, they fight the cockroach infestation. And so it is, I mean, not to paint a dire picture, but it continues to be an issue that renters continue to struggle, and there's just not enough aid for them.
And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and Geoff, feel free to chime in here as well, and then we'll come to you if not. But one of the things that you talk about is, sort of the renters feeling like their only recourse is withholding the rent, right? And eventually they land themselves in court. But what does the system look like for them? Like, what information, resources, because they're kind of, up against the legal system on their own.
Yes, and yeah. And so that's a really important question, I think, because the Chicago's landlord-tenant ordinance technically allows a tenant to withhold rent. So if a renter will just to read it today, they think that they're protected by the law. But what they don't realize is that law is actually very complicated. There's a series of steps that you need to take in order to withhold the rent and in order to defend yourself in eviction court, right? Like part of the problem is like once you end up in eviction court, it's even though the judge is technically supposed to ask you, well, why are you withholding rent and what's your defense? Most of the tenants do not get asked that question. One of the things that was sort of uplifting was as we were reporting the story, we were sending questions to the chief judge, and Chief Judge Timothy Evans shared with us that he understood that the imbalance that we were pointing out between landlords and tenants exists, and that he was getting ready to create. He hasn't created it yet, but he was thinking about a program that would allow tenants facing eviction to quickly access information about their landlords if their landlords were also being sued by the city at the same time. And maybe that could be a way of tenants being able to defend themselves in eviction court.
So it sounds like relief is a ways off system-wide.
Correct.
So Geoff, often, the disinvestment in homes and communities that leads to demolishing sometimes, or, just a blighted property, but can also lead to, demolishing vacant lot. How does that impact the community and then future home ownership?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the biggest challenges in reinvesting in a lot of neighborhoods on the south and west sides is the abundance of vacant land. It's there's a particularly high cost to rebuilding on that land, and a lot of the history of disinvestment has made those markets challenging for that type of new development. It really is much more common in high cost neighborhoods. So vacant land, I think, really, kind of presents a particular challenge for creating new housing, creating new rental housing, creating new homeowners that are affordable. Because I mean, not just is it a challenge to get people to develop new housing, but if you do develop it, um, new housing is not particularly low cost or affordable housing, even if you build it on, vacant land. So I think that figuring out a way to access that land at a low cost, find strategies to build that, new housing, be it for sale or for rent, and maintain that affordability over a long period of time is one of the biggest challenges, facing lots of communities in the city that have that abundance of vacant land.
Brandis, and I was just, if I might just add, sorry, as you were mentioning the question, I just thought a couple of things that maybe will be, a ray of sunshine, if you will, off in the distance. So there are a number of proposals on the table to help renters, including something called Healthy Homes, that would be sort of like a requirement that buildings are inspected in a certain amount of time to kind of check on those buildings and how the buildings are doing. There's another proposal on the table that would create an office of the tenant under the mayor's office that would, if renters have some kind of issue, potentially they could reach out to the office of the tenant, and the office of the tenant could resolve those issues. So I just wanted to point those out briefly.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. We've got a couple of comments in our chat. I want to get to those really quickly, and then I've got another question, I think probably for you, Geoff. But one of our guests is asking, what is the easiest way to help reach the Black and Brown communities as a property owner that wishes to rent? Is it as simple as finding a Black-owned property management company? How does a property owner help by accepting Section 8 vouchers? I'm looking to rent out a house in Jefferson Park in the next 1 to 2 years and feel I need to get this figured out sooner than later. Any advice? Nikki?
Yeah. I've got some advice for that. And one thing I wanted to mention too is that on the other side of this, like through the developer lens, like there's a lot of conversation about building affordable housing, and you get what are called LIHTC or low income housing tax credits in order to do it. Part of the problem with that is a problem of implementation. So as of right now, nobody can tell me, and trust me, I've asked, nobody can tell me how many affordable housing units there are, period. They can't tell me how many are currently in development. They can't tell me how many are available for rent. They can't tell me how many have been rented and for how long. Nobody's tracking it, and nobody's holding real estate developers accountable to provide the number of units that are then offset by the amount of tax credits they get in order to develop a certain property. So I think that's where we can begin to find some sort of like accountability or parity if we could just, I don't know, add up and count and come up with just even a system of tracking that. I think that would be an excellent start. But as far as folks who own property and they're interested in connecting with Black and Brown communities, do a little bit of research and figure out what are the nonprofit organizations, who are the organizers in that neighborhood, because those are the first people who you need to talk to. Always, you need to talk to the residents, and I would give that advice to anybody who's trying to rent a property. I would give that advice to any developers trying to come into a community. Please talk to the people who already live there. More than likely, they have a vision for what they would like to see in their neighborhood. They have history of what has worked and what has not worked in their neighborhood. And they can give you some strategies that even like a property management company doesn't necessarily have insight into. So I would say for us, we're a neighborhood association. We pride ourselves on being the gathering space for residents in Englewood. And so there's a reason why now, as we're almost 15 years old, developers who do come into Englewood, folks who do come into Englewood who are interested in transforming or developing, they come see us, because they know that we're going to like put them in connection with the people who live there, who are going to give them the insight to actually be successful at what it is that they're trying to do and build relationships that are going to be sustainable over the long term. Because I think ultimately when it comes to housing, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for long-term sustainability, long-term relationships.
Thank you, Nikki.
Yeah.
Another question, I think first to Geoff and then to Alejandra. So, if we've got these vacant lots, who is developing on them? Are these outside property owners who live in other, cities, or do many property owners still do the renting and or occupying? And what's sort of the relationship between renters and property owners?
So in terms of vacant lots, I think, one of the challenges is, you have a split in terms of who owns the vacant lots. So there are a lot of vacant lots that are currently owned by the city of Chicago. And for those lots, there is, a potential to work with the city to transfer those lots to some new owner who has a goal of redeveloping those lots. But I think it sounds like it should be pretty straightforward, but it ends up being much more complicated, I think, than that. And so, but in that case, at least you know who the owner is, and you can reach out to the city potentially and work with them to transfer that lot at a potentially a low cost, so that you can, not have to worry about at least paying for the land as part of the overall development cost. And there's a whole other slew of privately owned vacant lots that are, much more complicated to access, and owners who have a whole range of different potential investment strategies around what they're trying to get from that ownership. And oftentimes those are, hung up in property tax delinquency and scavenger sales and whatnot. So it's just, even more complicated potentially to get at those lots. So that's one of the reasons why redeveloping vacant lots is a challenge, is just getting control of the land. And then once you have control of the land, the next challenge is, how do you pay for the development? Oftentimes, lenders, unless you're accessing, different types of federal tax credits of some sort, those are incredibly complex and they don't really work very well for small scale development. So you need a development infrastructure of sorts that will help you use all, kind of access those resources and do all the different compliance that's required to really access a low-income housing tax credit type of funding stream. And that ices out, a lot of small scale developers who don't have that capacity, who may just want to invest in their community, but don't have the capacity to really access those kind of complex federal tax credits.
Alejandra, do you want to add anything?
Well, anytime I think about this question, I also think about the promises that were made to people who lived in public housing in Chicago, right? And the Chicago Housing Authority and the City of Chicago promised that they were going to rebuild, thousands of units of affordable housing, public housing, to replace the units that were being demolished. And we just have not, like the city and the CHA has not kept up with that promise. And so I think, that's another pressure point that I hear. Some activists talked about pressuring the city and pressuring the CHA to make good on the promises for those communities.
And I will say, RAGE, like we helped to develop the large lot program back in the day, back when you could get a lot if you lived next to it and you could acquire a lot for $1. We actually helped to innovate that and work with the Cook County Land Bank to give vacant lots to our residents to develop things like community gardens. And pop courts are a big thing in Englewood, which are like big fun, outdoor gathering spaces. But I will say too, with our work with the Chicago Neighborhood Recovery Project, we're sort of doing exactly what you're talking about, Geoff. We're looking at like the history of like the ownership. We're looking at things and actively trying to work on a strategy to clear out things like tax liens, to clear out things like water bills, to clear out things that would hold up the purchase or transfer of property, because we don't actually want those barriers to exist for people who do want to come in and develop. And we do have a lot of small developers in Englewood who are eager and ready. And that's why for us, we're also working on our strategy for how do we do this? How do we do development and rehab and redevelopment in a way that isn't going to leave the tenants sort of hung out to dry, and isn't going to leave like just, a family that just wants like a building, like a 2 or 4 flat. How do we do this in a way that gives them that opportunity to tap in?
Okay, so we're just about out of time. We did have one other comment that I wanted to share from one of our participants. Quote, "We had public housing to restrict the Black population, and now we have prisons," which I see some head nods, and that's definitely another community conversation because there's a whole lot to chew on there. So thank you for contributing that. So we're out of time. Professor Branham, I'm gonna give you the last word. And I guess I'd kind of like to hear from you, about sort of a reflection on, have we improved since, the passage of, the Community Reinvestment Act and, the Fair Housing Act, and what you would like to see going forward?
Well, I think I just make three simple points. One is we must continue the research. We must continue to know how many people there are in need of housing. We want to know what the available housing stock is and make sure that people are aware of the disparity between what is needed and what is being produced. Secondly, I would make the point that we need to use every facet of media, from books to video to documentaries to whatever, to present this to an audience that needs to be more involved. And third, and most importantly, we need to hold government and we need to hold politicians accountable. I keep thinking about Gail Sankata and the tremendous work that she was able to do, not only to present the case, but also to scare the bejesus out of politicians who are recalcitrant or government officials who are recalcitrant about doing something about the disinvestment in these communities. And that led to federal legislation. There are things that can be done. We must never be dispirited. This is a major challenge, and history shows us that the only thing that we can do is continuous concerted action.
All right, I like it. That was succinct. Thank you. You mentioned Gail Sankata. People can learn more about her because you did mention Shame of Chicago, Shame of a Nation, which aired right here on WTTW.
Thank you, WTTW.
Yes, it did. And of course, folks can search our website for more information on that. But for now, I'm gonna thank my 4 panelists for joining us for this awesome discussion: Charles Branham, Alejandra Cancino, Geoff Smith, and Nikki Patin. Thanks to all 4 of you. And of course, thanks to our viewers for joining today's WTTW News Community Conversation. Feel free to submit any story ideas, topics, issues that you think WTTW News needs to be covering. That email address is in your chat right now, so go and grab it before we have to shut this whole thing down. So you got it. You can email our producer, Emily. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please join me and the rest of us tonight on Chicago Tonight. It airs weekdays at 5:30 and 10 p.m. Again, I am Brandis Friedman. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.